football than the explosion of points. Fans have an affinity for their top picks, being explosive offensive pieces, but I don't love this year's wide receiver crop. Matter of fact, I think it's a little subpar. Let's start with that. What do you think of the crop of wideouts? What do you see so far, Coach?
Well, I think you're exactly right. And you heard a lot of people referring to this to an average draft. Well, it's an average draft on the scale of, like you said, being a sexy draft, the big impact, guys that touch the ball, the wide receivers, the running back. Now that we've got past the first two picks, clearly going to be the quarterback. But I think it's a solid draft, particularly on the defensive side of the ball. Obviously the quarterbacks are going to go 1 and 2. Tunsil, the offensive lineman, and maybe Ezekiel Elliott, and obviously the debate about do you take a running back this high because the value you can get them later. It's going to be a defensive-laden draft. And in that regard, I don't think there's that dominant, Clowney-type pick, although that hadn't turned out real well. There isn't that dominant, sexy, shutdown corner, although Ramsey looks to be pretty good. That's why I think it looks like as good as it is as a defensive draft, and outside of the teams that need a quarterback, and there's not many in the first 10, 12 picks, most of these teams need defensive help. I imagine they think this is a pretty darn good draft.
Coach, when you look at some of these quarterbacks, and the top two we're talking about are Jared Goff and Carson Wentz, who are consensus right now in the top two. But then there's Christian Hackenberg and Connor Cook. What really makes what's the difference, right? Because when I look at them, I evaluate them, and I say, well, this guy did this in college, and this guy did this in college. There's really not that much of a difference in predicting what they're going to be on the NFL level. So how do you determine that? You know what I mean? So how all of a sudden is Jared Goff supposed to be the number one best guy coming out in the draft this year at the quarterback position?
Well, that's the $64 million question, isn't it? Because you're right. It's getting harder and harder because in the college game, and it's great. I like the college game, but you look at quarterbacks, and they all do the same thing.
Yeah.
The entire team looks to the sideline. Nobody calls the play. They hand the ball off or throw a bubble screen. And how much of that are you going to do in the National Football League? So any of these guys, you're having to bet on to come a little bit. And the kind of question, are they good enough? Are they franchise guys? Well, if you think so, you got to take them, and you got to move up and take them, and you got to hope that you're right. But you're right. To separate the guys in that regard, most of these guys, notwithstanding Goff and Wentz and Paxton Lynch is in there as well probably, you're safer making them second-round picks because if it's amazing the difference between taking a guy with the 32nd pick in the draft, which makes him a first-rounder,
yeah,
and the first pick of the second round. Now, you're talking one spot. So in an analytical way, it's okay. No, that's appropriate. Well, no, it's not. Because I don't care if it is the 32nd pick of the draft. You take a first-round quarterback, if he misses, you're gone. As opposed to taking a second-round pick, okay, well, that was good value, and we didn't expect much out of the second round anyway. So I'm with you. Fortunately, I'm not in a position where I've got to make that distinction now. But how you separate that full group of quarterbacks to, with conviction, say this is a franchise quarterback and this isn't. Boy, I'm glad I don't have to make those choices anymore.
Brian Billick with us here on Tiki and Tierney, CBS Sports Radio. Well, let's pretend that you were still making those choices. Let's put you in the war room of the Cleveland Browns. Mr. Billick is coach of the Browns. You have a strong voice in the war room. Not that everything you say they will acquiesce to, but certainly your opinions bear a lot of weight. How are you attacking this draft? There's a million ways to go. What's the urgency? What's what do they have to do? How do you strike a competitive team here, Brian?
Well, once they made the decision, and clearly they did, that neither one of these top two guys is franchise quarterback. Because regardless of what you think of RG3, if your analysis says, and that's really what it comes down to, do you think Wentz and Goff are franchise quarterbacks or not? And if you do, you got to take them, or you got to try to move up and take them. If you don't, then you make the appropriate moves to get RG3, and we'll see. So clearly Hugh Jackson decided that Wentz and Goff were not worth franchise picks in the first round. Okay, right or wrong, you make those decisions. So you adjust the quarterback position. Now what do you do? The good news is that once you made that decision, you now get to fall back. You pick up some other picks, and you get to pick a player that you think is at a franchise position. So they're in great shape based on their analysis. Now, whether you think it's Tunsil at the offensive line, and you got a whole bunch of defensive guys to pick from. The good news for Cleveland, it's good news, bad news. The good news is, or the bad news is, no matter what you take, it'll help you because you're so bad at every position across the board. So the good news is, no matter what we take, that's going to be a starter for us at day one. Whether it's tackle Tunsil, would you go with a guy like Bosa on the defensive side of the ball, or a Miles Jack, you go on the inside with Buckner. Whatever you pick is going to help your defense or in the offensive line with Tunsil.
You know, when you look at the draft and it pertains to how guys are getting paid once they are in the National Football League, other than quarterbacks, you look for defensive ends. And you mentioned Joey Bosa. I think the kid DeForest Buckner out of Oregon, he's an interesting guy as well, even though he's a 3-4 DN, and he's enormous. He's like 6'9", almost 300 pounds. When you're looking for value, are you going for that kind of guy? You know what I mean? The guy who's playing that position that has become one of the at-need positions in the National Football League? Or are you going, we need this position, that position, or best available?
Yeah, well, everybody says best available. But particularly in the first round, it's amazing how best available just happens to be at a position we need. Your board tends to stack up that way. And in the age of hybrid players,
yeah.
You know, we talk about the hybrid defense. Is he a rush end? Is he a drop linebacker? Do you want him to do both? Is he a guy that can drop into the middle? Can he play defensive tackle and defensive end? You're right. The value of an inside presence via Geno Atkins has been elevated in the National Football League. Your corners are hybrid players anymore. It's not just a corner. Is he a nickel slot cover corner? Is he big enough to be physical on the outside at corner, or is he a pure cover guy on the outside? And the ability to cover outside and inside the slot seems to be different now. Is he a safety that can play inside and outside of the box? So there's a lot of flashes in what we're looking for in these players in versatility. So that really has become the key in all of these players. You may have a dominant player at a position, but is he versatile enough, and is there more value in that versatile player?
Coach, we know you're doing some work with Extech shoulder pads, which is the new #1 shoulder pad in American football. What do you have going on with that?
Well, we've rightfully so been focused so much on the concussion protocol and the helmets, but shoulder pads have kind of been a forgotten thing. But it's now time. We are at the next generation of shoulder pads. Extech pads has the new XRD military-grade foaming inside. You can go to xtechpads.com. We're in virtually every NFL club, more than 100 college clubs. Now you get it at the high school level. If you want to put your young men in the right pads to protect them, the Extech pads is the way to go.